Good morning. I want to come back again this morning, and there's something that we did yesterday that we didn't exactly cover, and so I want to come back and into our session here this morning, and we want to look at the board again, and we want to start now from Genesis. If you remember yesterday, we talked about. We went from Matthew all the way to the end of the book of Revelation, and we summarized the time from the time that Jesus was born to the time that he would return. So from Matthew, the Gospels, Acts, and the gap of time that we call the church age, and unto the very end when Jesus would return. But before that, we want to talk about, and this was within the context of the church. What we want to do this morning, and we want to only take about 5-10 minutes of your time, is we want to now go back to Genesis, right? Go all the way back to Genesis, and from Genesis to Matthew, we want to look at the timeline, right? Again, I'm in my Hebrew garb, and this is what I believe the Hebrews used to wear back in the day, and I think some people in Jerusalem still wear these outfits. And to be honest with you, the outfits are really it's hot in here, and it's very cumbersome. It's very difficult to move around when you have this much to carry around with you. I like our American clothing. I think it's a lot easier to maneuver and to move your arms and hands. With this much on you, it's kind of difficult to move around. But we'll manage for this morning. And so what we want to do this morning is just pray that God will bless our time here. We're only going to be here for a few minutes. So let's start. And this morning we're going to do it in the context of Israel. So yesterday we did it in the context of the church. Now we're going to do it in the context of Israel, and we're going to look at the first coming of Jesus. Right? So the whole preparation of the Old Testament is the coming of Jesus, and the entire preparation of the New Testament is the return of Jesus. Is the coming, the actual fulfillment, and then the return. Right? So you have the first coming, the time that he came, and then the preparation for his return. Now this morning we want to go back to Genesis. Now you know the first 5 books of Moses is called the Pentateuch. That is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And in the Pentateuch we talk about the tree here. You probably can't see it because it's probably not dark enough for you to see. Here is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? So in the Pentateuch, we have the story of the tree that leads Adam and Eve to death, and then we have the Abrahamic covenant, and this is probably about 6,000 BC or so. Now, different scholars will say that some scholars may say it's 10,000 BC. Other scholars will say it's 4,000 BC. So it depends on who's writing, whose opinion you're reading. Or conclusion you're reading in terms of time. So I just put there 6,000 staying in the middle, since we don't really have an accurate account of the time of how far back we go. So this is 6,000 BC per se. And the first block of time we want to look at is the time of the Pentateuch, from Adam all the way to Moses, right? Adam was the first man that God had made, and with Adam, he dealt with the issue of the tree of knowledge and good and evil. After Adam, a period of time had passed, and he began a relationship with man again, and it was Abraham, right? Abraham was the second person that God began a relationship with. After Adam and all of his children had died in the flood, God sort of like taken a backdrop, right? He took a step back, and just allowed man to be made and created, but man became evil and wicked and sinful, and the flood had to come and take them all away. And so God began a relationship with man again through a man named Abraham. And Abraham was asked, and this is in Genesis 12, Abraham was asked to leave his father and his mother, and both he and his wife Sarai, and she was barren, she couldn't bear any children. And I believe it's in Genesis 17 or so, God enters into a covenant with Abraham. It's a covenant of circumcision where every male Jew or every male Hebrew had to be circumcised. That is, the foreskin of their privates had to be cut off. And with Abraham, God also promised him that his seed will exceed like the sand of the seashore, like the stars in the sky, and so Abraham will multiply and become a great nation. And God considered Abraham to be a man of righteousness because Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteous. And so from Adam to Abraham, and from Abraham to Moses. Now through Moses, you know that God has given us the law, right? The 10 Commandments, and also God has given us the 613 laws throughout the Pentateuch, that is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those are the books in which the law of God was instituted and given to Israel. So in the Pentateuch we have the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We have the Abrahamic covenant. We also have the Exodus of the Jews. That is, the descendants of Abraham had become slaves in Egypt, and Moses was sent by God after speaking to him in Mount Sinai in Exodus 3, and he delivered the people of Israel. He gave the Jews the law, and he also gave them the atonement, right? In the Pentateuch you find the atonement of that is the animal being brought to the altar to be sacrificed, so that the sins of the people of the Israelites can be forgiven. So this first gap of time here is covered in the Pentateuch. Then, after we deal with the Pentateuch, which Moses have written, according to scholars, Moses was the one who wrote the 5 books of the Pentateuch. And then Moses dies, and he leaves behind Joshua as his successor. And Joshua takes over. And then the second part, now we begin the history of the nation of Israel. Now, Israel is no longer under the bondage of Pharaoh. They had been there for 430 years. It was Moses who was sent by God after he had left. Moses had a scuffle with one of the Egyptians. He killed the Egyptian, and he ended up running off and saving his life. Now, God comes to Moses at Mount Sinai and says, you have to go back and deliver your people, and I will be with you, and I will give you great power. So Moses goes to Pharaoh. Pharaoh basically says no 10 times. God destroys the nation 10 times and lets the people go. Now it's time for Moses to die. Moses, as he was dying, he passed on his succession to Joshua, the son of Nun, and then we look at the whole book of Joshua. There's about 24 chapters there, and Joshua becomes the new Moses for the nation of Israel. And Joshua basically, we call it Joshua's conquest. And Joshua, Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt into the wilderness, but Joshua led the people out of the wilderness and into the promised land. Moses could not cross over because Moses had hit the rock too hard, and he had sinned against the Lord. And because he sinned against the Lord in front of Israel, God did not allow him to cross over. So Joshua, the son of Nun, was the one whose conquest was to bring Israel into the promised land and to basically make sure that they got the land which God had promised. So Joshua led the children of Israel into the land, and basically for them to have, they had to fight 7 nations out of that territory. God basically turned the territory over to the Israelites, but they had to fight the kings of that territory. The problem is that the Gentiles who were living in those days were so wicked that God basically did not want them in that property anymore, and so the Lord sent Israel to basically wipe them out, men, women, children, sheep, cattle, whatever you have, and he gave them the promised land. And that was the land that was also promised to Abraham in the Pentateuch in Genesis. And so the promise of God had come to pass. The land, the children of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, were delivered, but they were also now given the promised land through Joshua. They were delivered through Moses. After the conquest of Joshua and upon Joshua's death, God raised up judges, right? God, that's what this hammer is here for. God raised up judges, and basically the judges, what they did was they acted as authorities over the nation to lead the people. So that's from the book of Judges, and there are several judges, and you all know the most famous of them all is Samson, the story of Samson and Delilah. Samson was the judge who ruled over Israel for at least 20 years. He was a man he was a Nazarite, he had long hair, and he could not cut his hair. He was given to the nation as a judge, and on account of God's dealings with the Philistines, he had something against the Philistines, and so he had put a relationship there between Samson and a Philistine woman named Delilah, and it was God's judgment against the Philistines that brought about the relationship that Samson and Delilah had. So then the nation of Israel was judged or led by judges over the course of probably over hundreds of years. Now during that time also, we have the story of Ruth. Ruth, remember, is the Moabitess woman, as a Moabitess woman, she really wasn't supposed to marry the Jews, but at that time, it was allowed. Ruth had married into the family of Naomi. Naomi had a husband and two sons, and basically Ruth was one of the daughter-in-laws. She married into Naomi's family, but the problem is that both of Naomi's sons died, and also her husband died. And upon her husband's death, Naomi sent the two daughters-in-laws back to their families, but Ruth was the one that remained. And in her kindness to staying with Naomi, God had allowed her to marry a kinsman, and I believe his name is Boaz. And Boaz gave a child to Ruth, and again, Ruth was allowed or permitted to marry into the family of the Jews, and because she had accepted the God of Israel as her God, and she had forsaken the idol gods of her people. And so she basically, the blessing of God for Ruth is that she began the messianic line of Christ. She gave birth to Obed. Obed gave birth to Jesse, and Jesse gave birth to David, who became the king, who replaced Saul on the throne of Israel in the future. And so, this is the line of Judah, I believe. And so this woman Ruth here begins the messianic line of Christ. And so this is the first portion of history. We talk about Joshua's conquest, the leadership of the judges, and then the beginning of the messianic line of Christ. We want to move on to the second portion of history, which is the book of Samuel, and the book 1 Samuel to the book of 2 Chronicles. What we have here is in 1 Samuel, the people of Israel, after the judges have passed away, the people of Israel demanded a king. In other words, God's kingship, and the judges whom God had given to the nation was not sufficient. And so the nation of Israel looked at the world and said, hey, you know what? We want a king like the rest of the nations of the world. We want to be just like them. And so would you mind giving us a king? Samuel, who was the prophet at the time, and the judge brought it to the Lord, and the Lord says, you know what, this doesn't please me because Israel no longer wants me as their king, and therefore I'm not happy. However, because this is their request, I'll give it to them, but this is what it's going to cost them. And so God raised up Saul to be their first king. He was a big man, a big Hebrew man, a beautiful man, a man who stood above everybody else. And he was, I guess, 6'5", 7 feet tall, but he was a big guy. Anyway, after Saul, who reigned in Israel for 40 years, came David. Now, Saul and David didn't exactly get along too well because David became the anointed, and the house of Saul lost the seat of authority over Israel from generation to generation. God passed on that power and authority to David because Saul became a disrespectful man, and he did not do the things that God had wanted him to do. So now in the line of So after Saul reigned for 40 years, David took over. David reigned for 40 years. Remember, David was a man after God's own heart, coming out of the house of Jesse. And he reigned for 40 years, and he passed on the baton to his son Solomon. And remember, Solomon was the one who built the temple. David was the one who authored all the psalms and the songs in the book of Psalms. And so we have the crown established, the leadership of the king, the crown established during this period of Israel's history. We also have the leadership of prophets in this time of history. Now, during the time of the kings, after the book of 1 Samuel, the book of 1 Samuel talks about Saul's reign. The book of 2 Samuel talks about David's reign, and the book of Kings basically gives you a synopsis of all the 1 Kings and 2 Kings give you a synopsis of all the kings of Israel. There's at least 22 or 23. It is about this time, too, that the nation is divided between Judah and Israel. Remember, there are 12 tribes. The first tribe, one of the tribes, the tribe that David came from and that God had established, is the tribe of Judah. And the other 11 tribes were the tribes that were called Israel. So there was a division after Solomon had left. After Solomon, the third king, had left, there was a division between Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and it was, and I believe that because there was disobedience in Jeroboam, Rehoboam had taken over Israel, that is the 11 tribes, and Jeroboam had taken over Judah, which is, I always get those two mixed up, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And so, in any case, so the leadership, so during this period of history in the books of Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, there is the leadership of the kings, the leadership of the prophets. Now, during the time of the kings, there were also the prophets whom God had used to basically talk and communicate to the nation of Israel and also to the kings. Let's see. Isaiah was one of the prophets. So from Isaiah all the way to Malachi, these were the prophets that God had used to talk to Israel during this time of Israel's history. Also during this time of Israel's history, the books of the poetry books are written in the Old Testament, and that is Psalms, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Songs of Solomon were written during that time, from 1 Samuel to 2 Chronicles. So during that time period, 1 Samuel to 2 Chronicles, you have all of the prophets, and most of the prophets, I would say, most of the prophets, and also the Psalms. And the songs and the poetry books were written. So you have the leadership of kings, a leadership of prophets, and a leadership of scripture. Because the Old Testament prophets wrote like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah. All of those people were authors of the Old Testament scriptures. And so it was during this time that the Old Testament scripture was being written, was continuing to be written, and God was giving revelation to the nation of Israel through the prophets and also through the kings. And so during this portion of history, you have the leadership of kings, you have the Psalms, you have the temple built, and you have the law, the continuation of the scriptures being given. Then we come to the final portion of Israel's history, which is the exile, and during the exile and upon the return after the exile. During the time of the kings, Israel had fallen into sin. The sin was idolatry. The nation, after Solomon had left, and it began really with Solomon. Solomon was the wisest of all the kings, the richest of all the kings. He had 1,000 wives and many children. And Solomon basically, as a result of being married to so many women, he was misled to worship idols, right? To worship these false gods, and the women misled his heart. You'll read that in 1 Kings 11. And after that, after Solomon was misled, so were many of the other kings of Israel and Judah misled into worshiping idols and serving idols. And God was not pleased with Israel on account of that and warned Israel, and that's why he had raised up so many prophets. The prophets were raised up during the time of the kings, or during the time of that period, so that they could talk for God and warn Israel not to practice idolatry. But Israel wouldn't listen, and they became disobedient unto God, and they would not respect his law, the law that he had given to them through Moses. They had been warned in Deuteronomy that if they fell into the transgression of the nations to practice idolatry, they would lose their land and they would lose their temple and their lives, and that's what exactly happened. So at the end of 2 Kings, God basically had brought the Chaldeans over from Babylon. If this here, this is Israel, the land. East of Israel was Babylon, right? Babel. And east of Israel is where the nation came from, and they came and they took over the entire land of Israel, and basically the children of Israel were taken captive, just like the children of Judah. Well, both Judah and Israel were taken captive. Israel was taken captive first, the first 11 tribes, and then Judah was taken captive into Babylon. Just to make that correction. And so both, remember, there was a division between in the 12 tribes. One tribe was left by himself, and then the 12 tribes were by, and the 11 tribes were by themselves. So 11 on one side and one by himself. And the one by himself, Judah, was taken captive by the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, and the others were taken by the Assyrians. They were taken captive. However, now the third portion of history, Judah had been taken over to the land of the Chaldeans. While they were in exile, in other words, in captivity, they were in captivity for 70 years. And so during that time, God continued to talk to the nation of Israel through his prophets Ezekiel and through his prophets Daniel. And so Isaiah was the prophet that God used to prepare them for the exile and to prepare them for what was coming. One of the kings, Hezekiah, had received some Chaldeans at one point during his reign, and he brought them into his house, and he showed them all his gold and all his silver and all of his stuff. And as a result of it, God told Hezekiah, your sons are going to lose all of that, and they're going to be taken away into captivity. And so the fulfillment of it was that when in 2 Kings, I believe in chapter 25 or so. And so during the exile, Isaiah and Jeremiah were the prophets. And Jeremiah, everybody knows, is the weeping prophet who wrote the book of Lamentation and wept throughout the entire book because Israel had been taken captive and they had suffered loss. The entire city was in shambles. The temple was destroyed. They were taken in captivity. During the time of captivity, during the time of their slavery, Ezekiel and Daniel were the two prophets that were raised up, and you all know the story of Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were thrown into a fiery furnace for not obeying the king, and also who were thrown to a lion's den, that is Daniel, for praying to God. And it was Daniel who also prophesied of the coming of Messiah, and that God had sent angels to Daniel to prepare the Jews of the coming of Messiah, and basically of his first coming and also of his return. Ezra, now after the 7 years of captivity, Ezra and Nehemiah were and also around that time the book of Esther was written. Remember, Esther was the Jewess who married Ahasuerus and ruled over 127 provinces. Ezra and Nehemiah, those two books were written at the end of the exile. They were the people who brought the Jews back after 7 years of captivity. And so I'm guessing this is probably about 500 BC or so. Now remember, we went from 6,000 BC, and don't quote me on the time, because we're not really sure at exactly the time when this all happened. Would have to go into the history books, and since this is a synopsis, I'm not giving you date and time and specific events, but just a general overview. So we'll just say about 500 BC or so, and it might be more or less. I can give you that information at a later time. But so Ezra and Nehemiah, after the 70 years of captivity, they go back to the land of Israel. They rebuilt the wall of the city of Jerusalem, and they also rebuilt the temple, and they rededicate the temple of God unto Him. The nations were not really pleased at Israel coming back because of the idolatry and the sin that they had committed the first time, 70 years prior to them leaving, and they remembered that, and they had stopped them on several occasions from building the temple. Now, after the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, there's a great silence. Israel falls under the leadership and authority of the nations. This is when the Roman Empire comes into authority over Israel and takes over the land. And this is in that 400-year gap period of when God, after the dedication of the temple and Israel's return and the coming of Messiah, there's a gap of time there where there is no word from God. There's no prophecy. There's nothing written in the scriptures. There's no scripture. There's no prophets. Nothing. Basically, there's just silence from heaven, and God has not said anything. And Daniel had prophesied that was going to happen. And so, in his book of prophecy, and so here, after the third period of history, where the Jews go into exile and for 70 years, and then they returned from exile, rebuilt the temple. There's at least a 400-year gap of silence, and the Jews fall under the Roman Empire. And this is, and we don't hear from God again until the 1st century, or at least around that time, the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd, 4th century, when the angel of God comes down to announce the coming of the fact that Jesus is coming in their day, and the time period changes from BC, before Christ, to AD, right? Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. And so, and remember, we already talked about the Gospels, right? Jesus, the Messiah, comes in Matthew, and his life, we talked about yesterday from Matthew to Acts. He was born, and he came, and he died on the cross and fulfilled all that God had commanded and had promised would be commanded, would be done in the Scriptures. So now that you have the entire, from Genesis to Revelation. So if you get the other video, you basically have the context of Israel. This is basically their history, and the whole purpose of this history was to prepare them for the coming of Jesus. And who is Jesus? Jesus is the King. Remember, we went in Samuel, when they first got the king. Remember, they had asked for Saul. Well, I believe that Jesus is the fulfillment of that request, right? Jesus is the fulfillment of that request, and he came down in the form of man. God came down in the form of man, and he is the king that he took the position of man, and he's the king that they had requested. The only thing is, he didn't come with the power to overthrow Rome. He came to deliver them from sin. But in any case, and that's a whole other a story in itself as to why Jesus came. And so you see the first part of the Old Testament. So the entire Old Testament, the context is Israel and the covenant that God had made with the Jews, and the preparation for the coming of Jesus, the Messiah. And the New Testament is basically the fact that Messiah has come, and then the preparation for his second coming. That's basically what that's the division, the three-part division of the Scriptures. The first coming of Christ, which is from Genesis to Malachi. The time that Christ was on earth incarnated is from Matthew to Acts, and then from Romans all the way to Revelation is basically the preparation for his return. So his first coming, the time that he was here, and the preparation for his return. And so I'm glad you were here with us today. I hope you got something out of our little synopsis here of Scripture. There's plenty of information that we did not cover, but if you go into, if you're really desirous of knowing the Bible, you basically need to go into a bookstore and purchase a history book, and that will give you all the information that you need. As far as getting the biblical information, you'll have to open the Scriptures and read that yourselves. And so, with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and turn this on. Hope you have a great day.